Welcome to the Farmhouse Museum. My name's Jan Fitzpatrick. I am a retired faculty in the Department of Apparel, Events, and Hospitality Management, and was the curator of the Textiles and Clothing Museum in Morrill Hall for several years. Today, we want to talk about quilts in the Farmhouse Museum's collection. And as the weather is getting colder, we start to think about the experience of being out on Central Campus. If you've been here before in winter, you know that it's very cold and windy and lots of snowdrifts. So think about then what it would have been like if you were on campus in the late 1800s. You weren't running into a warmed up building, you were coming into the farmhouse where you may be living and trying to get warmed up after being out in the cold. And in the downstairs level, the main level of the Farmhouse Museum, there would have been fireplaces as well as stoves to warm up the space. But when it got to be evening and it was time to go to bed, you'd climb the stairs to the second floor or to the third floor bedrooms, and it would be a little bit different, much chillier in those spaces. So what way to stay warm but put on your flannel nightgown. For the men, keep those long johns on and bundle up underneath a stack of comforters and quilts. And we're going to share some of those with you today. Before we go any further, I want to clarify a little bit about terminology. I'll be referring to the bed coverings as quilts and or comforters. And there is a difference between the two, and most quilters would know this, but a quilt consists of 3 layers. A top layer, which may be pieced or a whole cloth quilt. There's a backing layer that is, again, is larger pieces of fabric. And then there is a fill layer called batting that may be made up out of wool or a cotton. And the thing that makes them a quilt is that then they are secured by stitching that goes through the top, through all layers, and up through the bottom. So that's what makes something a quilt. A comforter may have those same 3 layers, but what's missing is the stitching. And rather than being stitched, they are tied to secure those layers and keep them from shifting. It's a faster method to finish off something, a bed covering and that comforter, but a lot of people don't understand that there is a little bit different terminology. Only one of the actual quilts, and it's the one we'll start with today, is a quilt. And again, it has the 2 layers, the top and the backing, but it's been stitched. So with that, let's go ahead and start with this first quilt that you'll see on the bed here. This wonderful bedroom in the Farmhouse Museum. I think some people refer to this as the master bedroom. You'll notice the beautiful ornate bed behind me here. And on this bed right now is a quilt that is very basic, but it'd be a good utility kind of a quilt for keeping warm, because in the winter, that really was the primary purpose of the bed coverings. This particular quilt is 80 by 69 inches, and the materials it's made up of are menswear woven wool suitings. So either the maker had access to that fabric, or maybe scraps of that fabric, or when a man's suit was worn out and not repairable anymore, we would cut patches from it. As you'll notice here, this is a very simple pattern, very basic, and one that's commonly found, especially for beginners. But it's a 4-patch quilt, so it's alternating lights and darks, and you can kind of see there's a progression of color as it goes across the quilt, which makes it a little more interesting. So it really becomes a work of art in itself in terms of the placement of the colors of the fabric. One thing to point out in the corner, as many quilt makers have done over lots of years, the quilt maker has left her mark by embroidering her initials using a chain stitch in the corner of the quilt. EJM is all we really know. We don't know what the quilt maker's name was or necessarily the date, but it's interesting to be able to see that, and some more research could be done to try to determine who indeed that maker was. Something else I'd like to point out is the backing of this particular quilt. It's made out of flannel, a woven flannel, and flannel, because it has a little bit of a loft to it, that brushed surface, that makes it warmer. It feels soft against the skin. And it is a stripe, kind of a green and a dark red coloring. And the finishing on this quilt, or the binding, on a lot of quilts, it's a separate piece of fabric that goes around the outside of the quilt. But in this case, the maker wrapped the backing around to the front side and then attached it so that it is not a separate piece. And again, this is a very efficient and quick method for finishing a quilt and having it ready to get on the bed when the weather gets cold. Next on the bed, we've put a comforter that is made up out of a blue and very, very pale blue and cream plaid wool fabrics. And this quilt is 72 by 73 inches in size. And the binding that you see on it, you probably notice up close, this red actually is very likely to be a binding that was used on the hems of women's skirts to help keep them clean, but also to give them some body and stability. The pattern that you see here is a variation of the log cabin block. So this is made up out of many blocks, multiple blocks, that start with a center square, and then a pattern is developed as strips are sewn and flipped to the outside, with one side being darker colors and the other being lighter colors. You've probably seen log cabin quilts that maybe had print fabrics in them also. The layout for this particular quilt is called straight furrows setting. Other variations of a log cabin quilt, although this one's a comforter, other variations though are things like raising the barn, sunlight and shadows. So there are a lot of different names for these particular types of piece tops. What makes this interesting is that the design is foundation pieced. And that means that underneath the design that you see here on each of these individual blocks is another thin layer of fabric, like a muslin, that those pieces are sewn to. And that helps to give it stability, but also to control the size. So when each one of those individual squares is done, then the top is assembled. This comforter does not have any batting in it, which makes it a little bit different that way. And I will show you the backing for this. It is, again, a striped flannel. And here you can see how the backing has been attached to the pieced top by using cotton twist yarn to tie it. And so these are about 5-inch intervals across the whole quilt. But the maker was actually very skilled in this, because when she inserted the needle on the back side, she caught the back of the foundation piecing, and you do not see a mark of it on the top of the quilt, but it's still put together so that it doesn't shift. This type of quilt top, the piecing, was popular from the 1860s on, and some people associate it with Abraham Lincoln's log cabin presidential campaign, and associated it with with rugged pioneer ideals. And you think about the pioneers who came across the United States and literally built log cabins. Another interesting feature of this quilt is that it also has initials of the maker, and they happen to be the same initials of the previous quilt. So we have two quilts made, quilt and a comforter, made we can presume by the same maker, which is really nice to have several works in a collection by the same quilt maker. Another thing you might notice at the top of this quilt is the extension of this plaid. Again, it's flannel, and it really just goes across the top and encases the top part of the comforter. And this is often referred to as a beard guard. And what it does is it protects the top from the oils of the skin of the people who are sleeping underneath, as well as from their hair and the gentleman's beard that may be coming out over the top of the bed covering. The third comforter that we're featuring today is this one on the bed that is called a courthouse steps. That's the name of the block. And this is another variation on the log cabin quilt because it starts with a center block. And for the log cabin quilt, the pieces are stitched opposite, and then it still goes around that center block. But so you can see that there are light blocks, so there's smaller blocks here, and then the next pieces that would be added are here, the green, and then on this side the gold, and over here the red, until it fills out that block. This is also foundation pieced like the previous comforter, and was made by somebody in the same family, if not the same quilt maker. What we're not sure of is based on the initials. On this quilt, one initial is different than on the previous two. So you can see on the corner, rather than EJM, it is EMM. We don't know. It's kind of one of those mysteries. Rarely would somebody change their middle initial, so who knows? Also, we know it's from the same family, at least, because it has the same backing fabric as the previous comforter, and is also tied in the exact same manner as the previous comforter. And so again, we have the pink cotton twist yarn. It actually isn't tied in as many places as the log cabin one was, but that still secures that top layer to the bottom layer. There's no batting in it that we can find evidence of. Let's see. Oh, in terms of the materials, it's primarily wool. We have some gabardine twill solids, yarn dyed plaid, which is evident at the bottom. It's a little bit hard probably from that angle to see it. It's kind of hard to know if that was a design intention or if it was we ran out of fabric kind of a thing. And then also some of the darker greens that you may see is actually a brocade weave. So the maker of this comforter was more than likely using things that were left over from previous projects to incorporate them into a bed covering to keep warm throughout the winter. I'm excited to include this particular comforter in today's feature about the quilts of the Farmhouse Museum, because even though it was made in the late 1800s, it definitely reads as very contemporary. And so that's really fun to see the juxtaposition of the solids versus the stripes. And in a minute, I'll show you the backing, which is a wonderful surprise for you. This particular comforter, again, not quilted, it's just tacked to secure the top to the bottom. It has no batting, but the blocks here have been string pieced. And what I'm talking about when I say string pieced is, again, there's a foundation fabric underneath, and then the quilt maker uses up a variety of fabrics that they may have in their stash or their leftovers or their scraps to create new fabric. So on that foundation, for example here, a red strip of cloth would be stitched down, and then the next fabric would be put face to face and stitched and then flipped up so that it filled up that triangular space. And to help accentuate the workmanship of the string piecing, it is paired then with a solid black. The fabrics included in this are cottons, wools, and some silks. And there are some condition issues on this particular quilt where especially the silks are starting to break down. It's called shattering, when the finishing that was put on the silks at the time is starting to erode the actual fibers of the fabric. And so there's really no way to counteract that. And so you just have to take care of the quilt the best way that you can, or the comforter. After the main part had been pieced, so all of these triangular shapes, a border was added. And this border is the same fabric as some of the black triangles that are used. So that's a little bit different than the previous examples where the design went all the way to the edge. The surprise that I find very delightful is the fabric that was selected as the backing for this particular comforter. We have this large overall floral print that is of the time period. You can tell that by the use of the large size floral that was often produced for home interior types of fabrics, and also then the choices of the colors. But it just is so lively and just a big surprise. So I can just imagine getting into bed, and here it's very somber on the top, but underneath it's all about playing. So you can see we've moved to a different bedroom on the second floor of the Farmhouse Museum. This is one of the bedrooms at the front of the house. So a little bit plainer headboard than you saw previously, but wanted to feature this particular comforter because it already was on this bed, and it's just so much fun. There are so many details to look at. Now, you might recognize this as what's called a crazy quilt, that it's made up of patches of a lot of different shapes and sizes. It's not real regular, although there are blocks that have been sewn. So you can see where there's a large square here that those particular pieces would have been, again, sewn to a foundation. And then all of the places where the fabric intersects have been highlighted with wonderful embroidery. This particular comforter, even though we'll call it a crazy quilt, is kind of the poor cousin of the fancier ones that you probably are more familiar with. This is more of a utility quilt. Again, the larger pieces and wools and some cottons may have come as extra pieces left over from dressmaking. And so rather than taking the time to cut all these little tiny pieces, this would have gone together much quicker, even though there's a lot of embroidery still on this. This particular comforter has both initials as well as a date embroidered into the corner. And the corner is opposite of where I'm standing now, but you'll be able to see that. It says 1895. So this is one of the few quilts that we actually have a date for. And the initials APA are chain stitched. So we have a different family. This came from a different source, but it's a wonderful example of something that would have been perfect on a bed for the winter months in Iowa. There are so many fun motifs on this that it's just kind of a feast for your eyes. And one of my favorite things at the head of the bed, where typically you would see pillows, I wanted to reveal the cat. And so this cat has been created using, let me think which kind of a stitch this is, a stem stitch. I'm not an embroiderer, so I don't know the names of all the stitches, but from doing some research, I identified chain stitches, herringbone, satin stitch, a tailed French knot, feather stitch, back stitch, and the stem stitch. And I'm sure there are others. as well as stitches that the maker maybe just kind of made up on their own. So we have the cat, very playful. There are at least 2 anchors which are represented on the top. We have a bird and a pond with a lotus flower on it, some bleeding hearts. There are a couple of figures over here who look like farm laborers, perhaps of some sort. Some things that look like snowflakes, more flowers. There's a swan here at the top. So it's very fanciful, but at the same time, really utility in terms of staying warm. The backing for this is a cotton, and it's just an all-over white dot on blue. The next quilt that we're going to see would be an example of that fancy crazy quilt, and you'll be able to see the difference between the two. But I really first want you to have an opportunity to look at all of the wonderful work that's done here in terms of showing off the skills of the maker and the really fun motifs that have been incorporated into the top of this comforter. We're going to end today's tour with a real showstopper. Here again, we've changed bedrooms. We're in the other front bedroom of the Farmhouse Museum, fondly referred to as the strawberry room because of the wonderful all-over print of the strawberries on the wallpaper. What we saw previously, the more utility crazy quilt, this is its fancy cousin. And this quilt is also foundation pieced, and it's interesting because it's very clear that you can see that the blocks, how they were constructed using small pieces of a variety of fabrics. And these fabrics would have been used in dressmaking. There are silks, there are brocades, there's velvet, there's taffeta, and there's even silk ribbon that's incorporated into some of the designs that have been embroidered on the top surface. And so again, we'd see that, how that would be put together. A comforter, a crazy quilt like this, would be created by an individual who was showing off her needlework skills, as well as showing off her affluence, because not everybody was able to take advantage of leisure time that was now something that was coming into the culture for those people who had the means to have other people do their housework for them. So a young woman or an older woman may spend time during her day honing her embroidery skills on a wonderful example like this. You'll notice this isn't bed size. It's actually 65 by 65 inches, and typically would not be placed in a bedroom. Because this is such a showpiece, it would be draped over a settee in the parlor on the main level to show off to guests who would come to visit. There is handmade lace edging, which is kind of an unusual finish on any type of a bed covering, but in this case, it's all about showing off the luxury and the lots of different textures and materials that are available. There are lots of interesting individual motifs that are incorporated into this particular crazy quilt. First of all, we do know the name of the maker of this, this particular crazy quilt. Her name was Lydia Carver Stark, and it is dated to 1881. Now, there was kind of a craze in the United States, pun intended, for the crazy quilt, and many people believe that in the late 1800s it was spiked by the influence of English embroidery as well as the Japanese art that was on exhibit at the Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia. And somehow that transferred and made its way to the Midwest. This particular work also won a prize in the Illinois Fair in 1888. And the Farmhouse Museum has those credentials to document that. So that's some of that provenance that's so important in being able to tell the full story of the handwork or any kind of artwork that might be shown. Some other motifs that might be found on this, there's a fan, you'll notice the fan, as well as lots of floral motifs. The maker's initials are on this patch here, this red patch. They're a little bit obscured by the extra floral embellishment that she added to it. Some of the yarns, as well as silk yarns to do the embroidery, were chenille, silk chenille, so there is some dimension to it. And one area that I would point out is there are some wonderful cattails here that literally are like popping up off the surface because they are using that chenille yarn to create them. Because this is decorative, not functional, it has no way to be washed, and that's about the materials, the silks that are used. And after over 100 years, about 120 years, it's sad, but kind of the natural progression of things, that there are some condition issues because, again, those silks are breaking down or shattering. And so if you have an heirloom like this in your family, you might want to find out ways that you can best preserve it. I always think the best way to start is to take a good photograph so that you have that photograph of it as it is at the present time. And also being able to document, if you happen to be a quilt maker or you have a family quilt that you know information about the maker, write that down. Make sure that it's included with that quilt. Something else I want to point out, and because this is not technically a quilt, the stitching doesn't go through to the back side, but the backing of this is actually a manufactured, something that was purchased, quilted silk fabric. So it still has that loft, and it adds to kind of the elegance that goes with a showstopper piece like this. Thank you so much for taking the time to view this video. I'm so happy to be able to share some of the wonderful bed coverings that are part of the collection at the Farmhouse Museum at Iowa State University. I myself am a quilt maker, and this is giving me lots of inspiration to go home and start on my next project. I hope to see you soon, again, just as a guest at any of the museums here at Iowa State University.